The city of Seoul never truly slept, but it bowed its head whenever Baek Hyun-woo walked through it. From the top floor of his glass tower, the lights of the capital looked like a sea of glowing embers that he alone controlled. He sat in a leather chair that cost more than most people earned in a year, his dark eyes fixed on a wall of monitors. Every screen showed a different part of his kingdom: shipping docks, luxury hotels, and the silent movements of his men. He was the head of a powerful group that ran the city with logic and strength, leaving no room for mistakes or feelings. People called him the King of Neon because he ruled the brightest parts of the night, but his nickname in the streets was Ice in a Suit. He was a man of perfect lines and sharp edges. His black suit was always pressed, his hair was never out of place, and his face never showed what he was thinking. To Hyun-woo, the world was made of math and targets. You were either an asset to be used or a problem to be removed. He had spent years building a wall around his heart, turning himself into a machine of pure power who had forgotten how to care about anyone. On this night, the air in his office was cool and quiet, smelling of expensive wood and old money. A digital display on his desk glowed with the words "Target Locked" as he finished a deal that would put another city block under his command. His assistants stood by the door, barely breathing, waiting for his next order. They knew that a single frown from Hyun-woo could end a career, and a single nod could make a fortune. He was at the very top of his world, surrounded by wealth and influence, yet he was completely alone in the dark. He picked up his phone to check the final numbers of the night. He expected to see a report from his docs or a message from a business rival. He lived for the thrill of the win and the steady climb of his bank account. But as he stared at the screen, a notification popped up that did not belong in his world of billion-won deals. It was a text from a number he did not know. It was not a contract or a threat from another gang. It was just one word, written in all capital letters, shaking with a fear that seemed to vibrate through the glass of the phone. Help. Hyun-woo paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. Logic told him to delete it. It was a mistake, a wrong number, or a trick. But for the first time in 20 years, the Ice in a Suit felt a strange shiver. He looked out at the glowing city he owned and realized that somewhere in those millions of lights, a tiny voice was calling out to the most dangerous man in Seoul. The cold machine he had become started to spark with an old, forgotten memory, and the King of Neon found himself looking at a target he hadn't planned for. Inside the small, dark closet, the air felt thick and hard to breathe. Eun-chae pressed her back against the cold wooden wall, trying to make herself as tiny as possible. Her favorite pink floral dress was wrinkled, and her knees were pulled up to her chest. All around her, the smell of her mother's lavender perfume on the hanging clothes usually made her feel safe, but tonight, it only made her want to cry. She squeezed her eyes shut, but she couldn't block out the terrifying noises coming from the other side of the thin closet door. There was a loud crash, like a lamp hitting the floor, followed by the heavy thud of someone falling. Eun-chae's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard her mother's voice, shaking and high, pleading with the man named Nam Ki-ho. "Please," her mother sobbed, "I just need more time." But the man's voice was like jagged rocks, loud and full of a mean kind of anger. He shouted words that made Eun-chae cover her ears with her small hands, trying to stifle the gasps that wanted to escape her throat. The closet was pitch black except for the glowing screen of the old phone in her lap. Her fingers were trembling, so much she could hardly hold it. She knew she wasn't supposed to touch her mother's phone, but her mother had whispered for her to hide and stay quiet no matter what happened. With blurry eyes and a shaking thumb, Eun-chae had typed the only word she could think of. The letters HLP stared back at her, bold and bright in the darkness. Suddenly, a new sound filled the apartment. The sound of skin hitting skin and her mother's sharp cry of pain. Eun-chae flinched, a single hot tear rolling down her cheek. She looked down at the phone, praying for a sign, for a miracle, for anyone to answer her silent scream. Then, the phone vibrated in her hand. The screen lit up her terrified face with a soft blue light. She looked down and saw 3 words from the stranger on the other side of the city. "I'm on my way." Eun-chae didn't know who the man was, or how he would find them. She didn't know that he was the most feared man in Seoul, sitting in a high tower surrounded by screens and power. All she knew was that someone had heard her. She gripped the phone against her heart, listening to the heavy footsteps of the monster in the living room getting closer to the closet door. She held her breath, staring at the sliver of light under the door, waiting for the shadows to move and hoping the man in the suit was fast enough to keep his promise. High above the city, the large meeting room was silent and cold. Baek Hyun-woo sat at the head of a long table made of dark, polished wood. Around him, 10 of the most powerful men in his company were talking about money, territory, and trade routes. They were showing him charts and maps, trying to prove they were useful to him. Normally, Hyun-woo would listen to every word, looking for a single mistake. But today, his eyes were fixed on the small phone resting in the palm of his hand. The word help was still glowing on the screen. It felt like a tiny fire burning in the middle of his frozen world. He looked at the men around the table. They were all wearing expensive suits and worried expressions. They were adults who knew how to fight for themselves. But the person who sent that text was someone else, someone small and trapped. His mind flashed back to a time when he was just a boy, standing in a dusty room and wishing for a hero who never came. Without saying a word, Hyun-woo began to type. His movements were steady and calm, even though his heart was starting to beat faster. He knew the child was hiding, so he sent a warning first. "Don't make a sound," he typed. Then, he added the promise that would change everything. "I'm on my way." He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask where she lived. He simply hit a button on his desk that tracked the signal of the phone, and a map of Seoul appeared on his private monitor. The target was locked. Suddenly, Hyun-woo stood up. The heavy chair scraped against the floor, making a loud noise that stopped the meeting instantly. One of his older advisors looked up in surprise. "Sir, we haven't finished the report on the shipping docks," the man said, his voice shaking. The other men stared, confused. Hyun-woo never left a meeting early. He was a man of perfect order and strict rules. Hyun-woo didn't even look at them. He grabbed his black coat from the back of his chair and pulled it on. His face was as hard as stone, and his eyes were cold. "The meeting is over," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room like a physical weight. "I have a more important contract to finish." He walked out of the room, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the floor. His guards hurried to follow him, whispering into their radios and trying to keep up. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't see the little girl in the pink dress or the dark closet. They only saw their boss, the King of Neon, moving with a kind of fury they had never seen before. Hyun-woo stepped into his private elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft hiss, leaving his world of money and power behind as he headed toward the storm. The elevator doors opened to the underground garage, where a line of black cars sat waiting like silent shadows. Hyun-woo did not wait for his driver to open the door. He stepped into the front seat of his fastest sedan, the engine roaring to life with a deep growl that echoed off the concrete walls. His guards scrambled into the cars behind him, but Hyun-woo was already moving. He shifted the car into gear and floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as he shot out into the humid night air of Seoul. The city was a maze of neon signs and crowded streets, but Hyun-woo had a map in his mind and a target locked on his dash. On the glowing screen in front of him, a small red dot pulsed, Eun-chae's location. He was miles away, and the Friday night traffic was a wall of red brake lights. To any other man, it would have been impossible to get there in time. But Hyun-woo was not an ordinary man. He tapped a command into his car's computer, connecting directly to his syndicate's private network. Suddenly, the world ahead of him began to change. As his car approached the first major intersection, the red light flicked to green. The cars coming from the side streets came to a sudden halt as their lights turned red, held back by the invisible hand of Hyun-woo's technology. He tore through the junction, his speedometer climbing higher and higher. This was Seoul's speed, the ability to turn the entire city into a private highway. The wind whistled past the windows as he dodged between slower vehicles. Buildings blurred into streaks of blue and yellow light. Every time a bottleneck appeared, his system cleared the path, overriding the city's traffic grid one block at a time. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his knuckles white, but his face remained like stone. Inside, however, his pulse was drumming a frantic rhythm. He kept thinking about the help message and the terrified little girl waiting in a dark closet. He pushed the car even harder, the engine screaming in protest. He wasn't just driving against traffic, he was driving against the ghosts of his own past. 25 years ago, he had been too slow, too small, and too weak to stop the shadows from taking everything he loved. Tonight, he had the power, the speed, and the technology to change the ending of the story. The red dot on his screen was getting closer. And the ice in his suit knew that every second he saved was a second closer to keeping a promise he had made to himself a lifetime ago. As the neon lights of modern Seoul blurred into long streaks of blue and gold, the hum of the engine seemed to fade, replaced by the ghost of a much older sound. In his mind, Hyun-woo was no longer a powerful man in a custom suit. He was a 10-year-old boy standing in a small, cold kitchen that smelled of damp wood and cheap noodles. The wallpaper was peeling, and the only light came from a single bulb that flickered just like the fear in his chest. That was the night the world had first taught him that being good wasn't enough to keep you safe. He remembered the heavy, rhythmic thumping on their front door, a sound that always made his mother's face turn as white as a sheet. She had hidden him behind the tattered curtain of the pantry, whispering for him to stay quiet, just as Eun-chae was doing now in her own dark corner, through a small gap in the fabric. Young Hyun-woo had watched a large man with a scarred face and grease-stained hands storm into their home. The man was a debt collector, a shadow that followed his mother because she couldn't pay for the medicine she needed to stop her coughing. "I don't have the money yet," his mother had whispered, her voice small and trembling. The man didn't care about her excuses or the fact that she looked too thin to stand. He had grabbed her wrist with a rough, calloused hand, his eyes scanning the room for anything of value. There was nothing left to take. No television, no jewelry, no furniture worth selling. Then, his eyes landed on her left hand. It was a simple gold band, thin and worn from years of hard work, but it was the only thing she had left of his father. "No, please," she had begged. But the man had twisted the ring off her finger with a cruel laugh. Young Hyun-woo had gripped the curtain so hard his knuckles turned white, his heart screaming for him to run out and fight. But he was too small. He was too weak. He had watched that man walk out the door with his mother's dignity in his pocket, leaving her sobbing on the cold linoleum floor. In that moment, the boy had felt a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was a hunger for power, a hunger to never be the one hiding behind a curtain ever again. The memory snapped back into the present as Hyun-woo swerved his sedan around a slow-moving bus. The phantom weight of that old helplessness felt like a lead brick in his stomach. He looked down at his own hands, now steady and strong, gripping a steering wheel that controlled a machine worth more than that debt collector's entire life. He had spent 25 years making sure he would always be the predator and never the prey. But the help message from Eun-chae had reminded him that there were still children hiding behind curtains and inside closets, waiting for a hero who usually never came. He pressed the gas pedal even closer to the floor. He wasn't just driving to a coordinate on a map anymore. He was driving to find that little boy who had been too weak to protect his mother, and this time he was bringing the full weight of his empire with him. The hunger of the past was finally turning into a cold, sharp purpose. The sleek black sedan screeched to a halt, the tires smoking against the cracked pavement of a narrow alleyway. Hyun-woo did not wait for the dust to settle. He stepped out of the car, his expensive leather shoes crunching on broken glass and discarded trash. The apartment building stood before him, a gray and crumbling tower that looked like a tomb under the flickering yellow streetlights. He did not look back at his guards who were just arriving. He moved with a cold, silent speed toward the entrance. The hallway inside smelled of old cooking oil and damp concrete. As he reached the third floor, the silence was broken by a sharp, splintering sound. Hyun-woo rounded the corner and stopped. The door to apartment 304 was not just open, it was destroyed. The heavy wooden frame was shattered, and the lock hung by a single rusted screw, swinging back and forth with a rhythmic click-clack that sounded like a ticking clock. It was clear that someone had used brute force to enter, showing no mercy for the people inside. Hyun-woo stepped over the threshold, his eyes scanning the room like a thermal camera. He had spent his life in boardrooms and penthouses, but he recognized this scene instantly. The small living room had become a battlefield. A plastic kitchen chair lay on its side, one of its legs snapped off. A bowl of half-eaten rice was smashed across the floor. The white grains mixed with the dark soil from a knocked-over potted plant. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp, stinging smell of cheap alcohol. Every detail told a story of a struggle. He saw a torn curtain hanging limp from a broken rod and a shattered picture frame on the ground. In the photo, a younger version of the woman he had seen in his files was laughing, holding a toddler with long, wavy hair. Now that glass was cracked into 1,000 jagged pieces, hiding their faces. The apartment was small, and there were few places to hide, making the violence feel even more crowded and suffocating. From the back of the apartment, a low, cruel laugh drifted through the air, followed by the sound of a heavy boot striking a wall. Hyun-woo's face remained as still as a mask of ice, but his hands curled into tight, powerful fists. The target locked display in his mind was no longer a digital map. It was the man in the next room. He could hear the muffled sobs of a woman and the terrifying silence of a child who was trying not to breathe. Hyun-woo adjusted his black tie and stepped further into the wreckage. He didn't shout, and he didn't run. He walked with the steady, terrifying confidence of a king who had come to reclaim his territory. The broken lock behind him was a sign of the monster who had broken in. But Hyun-woo was a different kind of shadow. As he moved toward the bedroom hallway, the cold hunger from his past was gone, replaced by a sharp, deadly purpose. The hallway was narrow, and the shadows seemed to shrink away as Hyun-woo stepped into the light of the bedroom. In the corner, a man with a messy shirt and heavy boots stood over a woman who was curled on the floor. This was Nam Ki-ho, a debt collector who liked to pick on people who couldn't fight back. He was holding a heavy wooden stick, and his face was red with a mean kind of joy. When he heard Hyun-woo's expensive shoes click against the floor, he spun around, a sneer spreading across his lips. "Who the heck are you?" Ki-ho barked, trying to look big and scary. He didn't recognize the man in the black suit, so he went back to his tough guy act. He stepped forward, swinging the stick in a slow circle, trying to intimidate the stranger who had just walked into his mess. "This isn't your business, pal. Get out before I break your pretty face." He thought he was the hunter in this room, and he thought Hyun-woo was just a businessman who had lost his way. Hyun-woo didn't move an inch. His face was as still as a statue, and his hands were relaxed at his sides. He didn't look scared, and he didn't look angry. He looked like a scientist watching a bug under a glass. The silence in the room became heavy, pressing down on Ki-ho until the bully started to fidget. Hyun-woo's eyes weren't looking at the stick or the threats. They were looking at the blood on Ki-ho's knuckles and the way the woman on the floor was trembling. "Your 30 seconds are starting now," Hyun-woo said quietly. His voice was low, but it cut through Ki-ho's shouting like a sharp blade. "That is how long you have to stay alive if you don't tell me where the girl is hiding." Ki-ho laughed, but it sounded forced and shaky. He swung the stick hard toward Hyun-woo's head, thinking he could end the fight in one move. He was used to people running away or begging for mercy. But the man in the suit didn't even blink. In a flash that was too fast for the human eye to follow, Hyun-woo moved. He caught the wooden stick with one hand, the force of the blow doing nothing to his steady grip. Before Ki-ho could even gasp, Hyun-woo's other hand was around the bully's throat, lifting him off his feet. The tough guy act vanished instantly, replaced by wide, bulging eyes and a frantic kicking of boots. The hunter had finally met a real predator, and the coward realized he was the one who was truly trapped. Hyun-woo did not lower the man. Instead, he held Ki-ho against the wall with one hand, his grip as steady as an iron vise. The bully's face had turned from red to a ghostly purple, his feet dangling uselessly above the floor. Hyun-woo reached into his jacket with his free hand and pulled out his sleek, dark phone. He didn't need to look at the keypad. His fingers moved with the speed of a professional pianist. With a few taps, he accessed the deep network of the city's financial systems, the world he ruled from his high tower. "A man like you thinks power comes from a wooden stick," Hyun-woo said, his voice cold and flat. "But real power is the ability to make a person vanish without leaving a single mark." On the screen of his phone, Ki-ho's entire life began to appear in glowing rows of data. Hyun-woo saw every cent the man had stolen, every illegal debt he had collected, and every dark corner of his history. To the rest of the world, Ki-ho was a ghost, but to Hyun-woo's system, he was just a series of errors that needed to be deleted. First, Hyun-woo tapped a command that sent a silent signal to every major bank in Seoul. In a heartbeat, Ki-ho's bank accounts, filled with money taken from families like Eun-chae's, dropped to zero. The digital numbers blinked once and vanished, moved into a private fund for victims of debt violence. Next, Hyun-woo sent a file to the police department's most honest investigators. It contained years of evidence of Ki-ho's crimes, including photos, recordings, and lists of names that Ki-ho thought were hidden forever. By the time the sun came up, the tough guy would be the most wanted man in the country. But Hyun-woo wasn't finished. He made one final call to the underground brokers who gave Ki-ho his jobs. "Nam Ki-ho is no longer under my protection," Hyun-woo whispered into the phone. In fact, he is a debt that I am now collecting. He could hear the person on the other end gasp. In the world of the Neon City, being marked by Baek Hyun-woo was a fate worse than prison. It meant that no one would ever hire him, no one would ever help him, and every door in the city would be slammed in his face. Finally, Hyun-woo loosened his grip, letting Ki-ho collapse onto the messy floor. The bully gasped for air, clutching his throat, his eyes darting around the room in total terror. He wasn't a hunter anymore. He was a man who owned nothing, had no friends, and had nowhere to run. He looked up at the ice in a suit, hoping for a spark of mercy, but he found only the cold, hard stare of a king who had just finished a chore. You have 10 minutes to run before the police arrive, Hyun-woo said, stepping over the broken picture frame. If I ever see your shadow in this neighborhood again, I won't use my phone. I will use my hands. Ki-ho didn't wait for a second warning. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted out of the apartment, his heavy boots thudding down the hallway as he disappeared into the night. Hyun-woo didn't watch him go. He turned his back on the coward and looked toward the hallway where the shadows were deepest, his mind focused on the small, brave girl still waiting in the dark. The apartment fell into a heavy, ringing silence after the sounds of the bully's running footsteps faded away. Hyun-woo stood in the middle of the mess, his chest rising and falling slowly as he calmed his breathing. He straightened his black tie and smoothed the front of his suit, making sure he looked like the composed man from the high-rise office again. He did not want to look like a monster to the person still hiding in the shadows. With a soft, steady step, he walked toward the hallway where the air smelled of lavender and fear. He stopped in front of the small closet door. It was old and scratched, but it was the only thing in the apartment that hadn't been broken. He could hear a tiny, jagged breath coming from inside, the sound of someone trying very hard to be invisible. Hyun-woo didn't reach for the handle right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, letting his presence be known without being scary. He thought about the help message on his phone and how it had traveled across the city to find him. Gently, he wrapped his fingers around the cold metal knob and turned it. The door creaked open just a few inches, letting a sliver of light from the hallway peek into the darkness. Inside, a pair of wide blue eyes stared back at him, filled with a terror so deep it made his heart ache. Eun-chae was huddled against a pile of coats, her small hands still gripping the phone. The screen was still glowing, casting a pale blue light over her face and her pink floral dress. When the blue light of the phone met the calm black of his suit, the world seemed to stop moving. Hyun-woo knelt down so he was at her eye level, making himself look smaller and less threatening. He didn't say anything at first. He just let her see that he wasn't the man with the wooden stick. He saw the way she looked at his face, searching for a sign that she was finally safe. Her bottom lip trembled, and she slowly lowered the phone from her chest. "Are you Matt?" she whispered, her voice so small it was almost a ghost of a sound. Hyun-woo realized she was using the name from the message. He nodded slowly, a softness appearing in his eyes that his business partners would never recognize. "I'm here, Eun-chae," he said quietly. "The bad man is gone. You don't have to hide anymore." He reached out a hand, palm up, leaving it steady in the air for her to take whenever she was ready. Eun-chae looked at his hand and then back at his face. The fear in her eyes began to melt away, replaced by a tiny spark of hope. She reached out with a shaking hand and placed her small fingers into his large, strong palm. The contrast was startling. Her skin was fair and soft, while his was scarred and tough from years of fighting his way to the top. As he gently squeezed her hand, Hyun-woo felt a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't felt in 25 years. He had stepped out of his tower to hunt a coward, but as he pulled the little girl out of the dark, he realized he was finally stepping into the light himself. The smell of bleach and old dust was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh lilies and clean air. When Ji-yeon slowly opened her eyes, she didn't see the cracked ceiling of her apartment or the flickering yellow light of the hallway. Instead, she saw a room that was as white and bright as a cloud. The walls were smooth, the floor was polished like a mirror, and the bed she lay in felt softer than anything she had ever touched. For a moment, she panicked, her heart racing as she remembered the heavy boots and the crashing sounds of the night before. She tried to sit up, but a gentle hand touched her shoulder. "Easy now, Mama," a small voice whispered. Ji-yeon turned her head and saw Eun-chae sitting in a large, velvet chair next to the bed. The little girl looked different. Her face was clean. Her hair was brushed, and she was eating a bowl of bright red strawberries. She looked safe. Behind her, a woman in a crisp white doctor's coat was checking a digital monitor that hummed quietly. The doctor smiled kindly at Ji-yeon and told her she was in the best private hospital in Seoul. Ji-yeon struggled to find her voice. How did we get here? Who paid for this? She knew they had no money, and she knew the man who had attacked them would never have helped. She expected to wake up in a crowded hallway or a cold clinic, not a luxury suite with a view of the city skyline. The doctor stepped back and pointed toward the door, where a tall man in a dark suit was standing quietly, looking out the window at the morning sun. The chairman has taken care of everything, the doctor said. Ji-yeon watched as the man turned around. It was Baek Hyun-woo. He didn't look like a debt collector or a street thug. He looked like a king from a movie. His black suit was perfect, and his face was calm, but his eyes held a strength that made the room feel steady. He stepped toward the bed, his hands folded behind his back. He told her that Nam Ki-ho was gone and would never bother them again. He explained that all their debts had been erased and that a private security team was now watching over them. Ji-yeon felt tears stinging her eyes. She didn't understand why a man with so much power would spend his time saving a mother and daughter he didn't even know. She tried to thank him, but Hyun-woo simply shook his head. He looked at Eun-chae, who was now holding his hand with a big smile, and then back at Ji-yeon. He told them that they didn't owe him anything. In his world of target lock deals and cold logic, he had found something more important than profit. As the morning light filled the white room, Ji-yeon realized that the nightmare was finally over, and a man who was once called ice in a suit had become their greatest protector. Hyun-woo stood by the large hospital window, watching the sun climb over the jagged peaks of the Seoul skyline. For the first time in many years, the target lock display on his phone was dark, and the constant noise of business deals in his head had finally gone silent. He looked at his reflection in the glass and didn't see the cold ice in a suit who ruled the city with a frozen heart. Instead, he saw a man who had finally stopped running from a ghost that had followed him since he was 10 years old. In the reflection, he could see Ji-yeon resting peacefully and Eun-chae coloring a picture with bright crayons. Saving them hadn't been about money or power, the things he usually chased until his hands bled. It was about a debt he had carried since the night a mean man took his mother's gold ring while he hid behind a pantry curtain. For 25 years, Hyun-woo felt like he owed the world a life because he had been too small and too weak to be a hero when it mattered most. He had built an empire of neon lights to hide the boy who was once afraid of the dark. As he watched Eun-chae laugh at a drawing, Hyun-woo felt a heavy weight lift off his shoulders, like a suit of armor he no longer needed to wear. He realized that he wasn't just a predator who destroyed bullies like Nam Ki-ho. He was someone who could build a wall of safety around people who had no one else to turn to. By answering that one help message, he had stepped back into the past and changed the ending of his own sad story. The little boy from the cold kitchen was finally safe because the man he became had finally used his power for something good. He touched the cool glass of the window and felt a strange sense of peace. He had spent his whole life taking things from the world to prove he was strong, but giving back had made him feel more powerful than any billion-won deal ever could. The debt he felt he owed to his mother and his younger self was finally marked as paid. He wasn't just the king of neon anymore. He was a guardian who had found his way home. The golden afternoon sun cast long, peaceful shadows over the playground of a bright and modern school. The sound of children laughing and shouting filled the air, a happy noise that belonged to a world far away from dark closets and broken doors. In the middle of the yard, Eun-chae ran with a group of friends, her long wavy hair bouncing behind her. She was wearing a new blue backpack and a wide, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She looked like any other happy child, no longer haunted by the fear that had once made her hide in the dark. A few blocks away, a sleek black sedan was parked quietly under the shade of a large oak tree. Inside, Baek Hyun-woo sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. He wasn't looking at a target-locked screen or a map of city territory. He was simply watching Eun-chae through the window, making sure she made it to the school bus safely. He didn't need to go over and say hello. He was content to be a silent shadow, a guardian who watched over them from a distance to ensure their world stayed bright. Since that night in the apartment, Hyun-woo's life had changed in ways he never expected. He still ran his empire, but the ice in a suit had thawed. His men noticed that he was no longer just a machine of logic. He was a leader who protected his own. He had used his wealth to build schools and safe houses, turning his power into a shield for those who were too small to fight for themselves. He had realized that being a boss meant more than just owning the city. It meant being responsible for the people living in it. Eun-chae stopped for a moment and looked toward the street, as if she could feel his steady presence nearby. She didn't see him behind the tinted glass, but she waved a small hand toward the row of parked cars before climbing onto the bus. Hyun-woo felt a faint smile touch his lips, a real, warm expression that didn't belong to a mafia boss. He put the car in gear and drove away slowly, heading back to his tower of neon lights. For the first time in 25 years, the king of neon was truly at peace, knowing that he had finally kept the promise he had made to a little boy in a cold kitchen a long time ago.